Hey guys, Mr. Happy here, and welcome to Final Fantasy Bestiary. Googled it this time. That's how it's pronounced. I'm going to get it right from now on. Where we're going to be doing this episode on the Gigas. Now, the Gigas are a really old Final Fantasy character. However, they have been making more recent appearances that are bigger and more varied than their previous experience. For those of you who don't know, Gigas is actually the Greek word for giant, and it may be used to designate certain enemies in the Final Fantasy series that aren't actually Gigas, but that's what the term actually means, and well, that's just one way of describing them. Like I said, they're a recurring enemy in the Final Fantasy series, and they're also called giants for a good reason. And I also have another name that we'll get into in some of the later entries into Final Fantasy. Now, as stated by their name, they are extremely large, and for the most part, they are extremely physically powerful. But in some games, they tend to be also extremely magically powerful as well. This is mostly in the older Final Fantasies. Some of the more recent ones, they're not always magically strong. There are a select few that have that, but for the most part, these are their defining traits, that they are giant, physically and magically strong creatures. And they're humanoids as well, so they're just over you. Anyway, they premiered back in Final Fantasy 1, making them the original baddies, and in this game, they had varied elements. There was, of course, the base Hill Gigas, but there was also the Fire, Flare, Ice, and Elm Gigas, and each one had their own elements and spells that they would cast. So this is really where it began for them. However, it wasn't always a steady road. They did appear in Final Fantasy 2, and they recurred the role similar. They had some Gigas that had similar names, including the Elm Gigas and the Ice Gigas and the Fire Gigas. They had a lot of recurring names. However, after Final Fantasy 2, they did not appear again until Final Fantasy 5. Now, again, in Final Fantasy 5, they just recurred their role a little bit. They just more elements, more physically strong. Same with 6 and 7. They really didn't do too much in all of these titles, and they were never really given a dominant feature. They were just sort of, sometimes they casted wind magic, sometimes fire, sometimes ice. They just essentially changed their magic and maybe changed their names slightly. Hill Gigas was very common, but so was Elm Gigas and Fire Gigas, so they changed slightly, but nothing too significant. Now, in Final Fantasy IX, they didn't have too much of a role, but this is a game worth noting because it was actually a mistranslation in the English game where there was a boss that was called the Hill Gigars, which was actually supposed to be translated to Hill Gigas. Now, Final Fantasy X is where the Gigas actually completely kind of get pushed aside. In 10, they are never actually called the Gigas. Not until 10-2 are they actually given the name. In 10, they are just a fiend-type enemy, and there's a few of them. Ogre, Bashura, Kodos, and Wendigo. And for the most part, we would just consider them Ogre types, even though they're just a fiend-type enemy with those names. However, in 10-2, one of them is formally given the name Gigas, which pretty much means we can lug the rest of the enemy type in with Gigas and officially call them such. There are two other enemies named Gug and Hrimthurs in Final Fantasy X-2, and in both games they are extremely physically powerful. That is their defining trait, is their extreme physical power. They are big, they have multiple hands, and in their defensive stance they can counter your attacks if you don't kill them. Now in X-2, there was sort of an ode to the earlier Gigas, where in Oversoul they would gain access to extremely powerful magic, usually tier 3 and above magic. So that is sort of an ode to the original Final Fantasies. However, it wasn't really until Final Fantasy XI where the Gigas were given a formal role. And even that's kind of stretching it for Final Fantasy XI. They did play an important role in the war against the Beastmen. They were a race of Beastmen previous to that were from a continent to the north of Quant, which is where Kufim Island is for anyone who plays Final Fantasy XI. And every few decades they would come down to Kufim Island, they would kidnap some human slaves, and they would retrieve supplies. So they essentially said, we need your stuff, we're taking some of you with us. And keep that in mind for some of the future things we're going to talk about with them. They were recruited by the Shadow Lord, who is essentially the guy getting all the Beastmen together and saying, alright, we are going to take over right now. And they were hired to build castles of vault and to fight and siege enemy fortresses. Now, after losing the war, however, they were stranded on the mainland, and they mostly retreated to Kufim Island and Delkfoot Tower, which was an ancient Xylardian structure. And they pretty much reside there today. Now, you can find them in pockets across the rest of Vana'diel and in other places, but for the most part, they consider Kufim Island their home. I want you to keep in mind the slave thing when we're talking about the rest of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy XII, however, not so much. They go back to being a very basic enemy in Final Fantasy XII. They're just a giant-type enemy, and there's a few bosses and a few marks involved with them. In the international version, there's a few extra bosses that involves them, but nothing too significant. Now, Final Fantasy 13 is actually where it gets a little bit interesting because this is where the Gigas stopped being called Gigas. Again, I know in 10 they weren't actually called the Gigas, but I think we can officially call this the end of the Gigas role. Now, in Final Fantasy 13, there is an Eidolon, Vanille's Eidolon, called Ekaton Hires, I believe it's pronounced. I'm sorry for anyone who might be Greek and might be, know the pronunciation better than me. And it's actually an ancient Greek name for the three giants who overthrew the Titans. So it's actually an ancient term for very Titan-like creatures as it is. And the name translates into 100 hands, which the Eidolon in Final Fantasy 13 actually did. He had very many hands. So it was a very good play on the words. There's some more history there from ancient Greek, but for the most part, that's all you really need to know, is that is the name you're going to hear, Ekaton Hires. So, moving on to Final Fantasy 14, which is where we are today. Of course, the Gigas makes very small appearances across other games, and for the most part, they are extremely negligible, even over to Theatrum, where the Final Fantasy 11 ones appear again. However, in Final Fantasy 14, they have taken the name of Vanille's Eidolon, slightly changed it around, but it's still Ekaton Hires. It's actually pronounced in such a way that it's easier to guess the pronunciation. It's actually the I and the E from Final Fantasy 13 have been switched around, which isn't that big of a change. However, they are actually slaves in Final Fantasy XIV, or at least they were. 300 years ago, under the Lost Thorn dynasty, they were essentially the thralls of the dynasty. And they would do all the heavy lifting. They would essentially be the ones who would be down in the mines. They would be gathering supplies and minerals, things such as that. They would basically the slaves of that dynasty. And that means that, considering that was 300 years ago, and they're now still alive in A Realm Reborn today, that's something. That means that they have an extremely long lifespan in Final Fantasy XIV, because surviving underground with basically nothing, no light, no anything, to survive for over 300 years, that's a little bit impressive. May also go to say that they don't need much food or water to survive, if any at all, which is why they would have made great slaves. Now, they are located currently in the Copperbell Mines, which is a level 16, 17 dungeon around that area. And essentially, as you dig down into the Copperbell Mines, they begin coming back up. Now, I would love to see more of the Ekaton Hires in Final Fantasy XIV, and because a dynasty, I'm sure, didn't just take place in the Copperbell Mines, I'm sure that they'll be surfacing across many places in the Final Fantasy XIV world. But anyway, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this. If you did, please like, favorite, subscribe, and share. Be sure to give your ideas for a Bestiary video in the comments below. Also, check out my Facebook and Twitter. Those are in the description. And if you want to donate to my YouTube channel, there's links in the description for that as well. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, take care.